opening up the e-file and diagonal immediately to control central space and prepare for rapid development. The Sicilian defense immediately challenges white's central pawn and promises dynamic counterplay, establishing asymmetry from the outset. Opening the door for a variety of Italian or English opening setups, this knight directly challenges central space. Developing a knight to its natural square fortifies the center and prepares for d5. Developing the knight this way prepares kingside castling and bolsters the center, though it cedes some initiative. Opening a diagonal for the queen's bishop and solidifying the center, this move prepares for central pawn expansion and development. Unlocking the center, white immediately challenges black's pawn chain, seeking to open lines and exploit the cramped knight on g2. Accepting the pawn presents an open central file, demanding immediate attention to piece development and pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn opens diagonals for your queen and bishop, putting immediate pressure on black's center. Developing the queen here, black aims to connect the rooks and prepare for pawn advances on the queen side, while indirectly supporting the e6 pawn. Unleashing the kingside pawns here immediately creates significant structural imbalances and opens lines that, while potentially potent, also expose your own monarch to considerable danger. Preparing to stake a claim on the queen side, black's pawn push anticipates a potential kingside expansion by white, aiming to maintain central tension and prevent a sudden pawn storm. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal, this square prepares for potential kingside expansion and controls key central squares, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering options. Developing the bishop to this active square pressures white's knight and prepares to challenge the central pawn structure, potentially opening lines for attack. Trading off the knight for the bishop here immediately alters the pawn structure, potentially weakening black's queen side and simplifying the position, but it also grants white an open c-file that might become a strategic asset later. Reclaiming the pawn disrupts white's advanced center and immediately resolves any structural imbalance created by the exchange, offering a more solid pawn formation for black. Foreshadowing a powerful queenside thrust, this piece repositioning aims to exploit any laxity in black's pawn structure, potentially preparing a central pawn push or initiating an assault on the weak squares that might emerge. Sacrificing piece harmony for pawn structure clarity, black liberates the queen and forces white to confront a doubled pawn, potentially weakening its central control and creating long-term structural imbalances. Creating an isolated pawn on the queen side offers white attacking chances down the open b-file, but leaves the pawn vulnerable long-term. Black's queen is now well placed to harass this doubled structure. Developing the knight to f6 is a fundamental impulse, bringing a piece into play and contesting central influence, though it doesn't immediately address the compromised queenside pawn structure. Consider how this knight can later support a central break or defend weakened squares. Developing the bishop to this square aims to challenge the c5 pawn and establish an imposing presence on the central diagonal, subtly pressuring black's king and potentially opening lines for future attacks. Launching a pawn storm on the queen side creates immediate space for black, but it also potentially weakens the pawn structure and could overextend forces, inviting white's central pieces into an aggressive advance. Aggressively cracking open the queen side, this maneuver seeks to exploit the shattered pawn structure on that flank, aiming to create lasting weaknesses for black's pieces. Bringing the bishop to b7 immediately confronts the central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's d4-e4 pawn duo, and potentially exploit the weakness on c3 after the capture on c3. A pragmatic decision to fortify the queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances along the b-file. The rook's relocation to b1 serves multiple purposes. It defends the b2 pawn, potentially pressures black's queenside if the pawn structure opens, and importantly, clears the way for the c-pawn to advance if needed. This is a move that prioritizes structural integrity and future pawn play, rather than an immediate tactical confrontation. It's about establishing a solid foundation for white's pieces, especially after the pawn exchanges and the doubling of white's c-pawns. Consider how this repositioning might influence black's own development and attacking ideas, forcing them to reevaluate their options. The castling here secures the black king, but opens up a fascinating tactical interplay on the queen side, as white's pawn majority is now primed to advance. Probing for weakness, white's rook boldly ventures onto the fourth rank, aiming to exploit the now somewhat exposed black kingside, particularly if black fails to adequately defend against potential incursions along that side of the board. Black boldly injects central dynamism, challenging white's pawn structure and seeking to liberate their pieces from the cramped position, a classic Sicilian counterpunch aiming to destabilize white's d-pawn. Initiating a tactical skirmish, white seizes the pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. The capture creates immediate tension on the queen side, forcing black to consider the consequences of recapturing. This bold action injects dynamism into the position, potentially leading to imbalances that could be exploited later. Consider how this pawn exchange might affect the central pawn control and the strategic fight for the open files. Sacrificing a pawn here opens up the file and potentially puts pressure on white's weakened queenside pawn structure, though it does leave black somewhat behind in material. White decisively seizes a central pawn, initiating a critical phase where black's queenside pawn structure is severely compromised, and the king is exposed to potential threats across open files. This capture instigates a tactical skirmish that will test black's defensive resilience and ability to coordinate their pieces under pressure, potentially leading to a material advantage for white if black doesn't react with pinpoint accuracy. Re-establishing central influence and preparing for further queenside expansion, the queen now eyes the potential weakness on c3 after white's pawn structure was fractured. Fortifying the royal sanctuary becomes paramount now, ensuring the monarch's safety amidst this emerging pawn structure chaos and potential peace exchanges. A daring raid into enemy territory, this knight's foray aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and exploit the doubled pawns, but it leaves itself exposed and could become a target for swift counterplay. White is initiating a subtle regrouping, aiming to redeploy the bishop from its somewhat exposed d3 square to a more active and protected outpost on e4, from where it can exert pressure along the central diagonal and potentially support a kingside initiative. This repositioning offers flexibility, allowing white to defend against black's developing queenside pressure while keeping options open for pawn pushes like f5 or g4, depending on black's response. The intention is to consolidate white's position and prepare for future offensive actions, acknowledging the current tactical balance while seeking a positional advantage through piece harmony. The bishop's relocation to a6 immediately targets white's isolated queenside pawns and subtly aims to disrupt the coordination of white's pieces by forcing a response on that wing. Unleashing a sudden pawn thrust, white immediately challenges the bishop's dominion and aims to sever black's connection to the queenside. A bold knight retreat, seeking refuge and preparing for a potential central counterstrike. The knight now eyes the weak f4 pawn, potentially disrupting white's attacking ambitions. Suddenly opening the center with that pawn thrust introduces significant tactical complications and shifts the focus to controlling the newly created central diagonal. Black boldly brings the knight to the center, creating a dynamic situation where it eyes the vulnerable white king and the d3 bishop. Striking at the knight's anchor point, this aggressive pawn thrust initiates a strategic confrontation, potentially rerouting the defender or forcing a positional concession. Liberating the dark-squared bishop opens up a dynamic counterplay, forcing white to confront the immediate threat to their central pawn structure. Unlocking the long diagonal for the queen, this recapture aims to disrupt black's newly established knight outpost and potentially create immediate threats against the kingside. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to contest the open c-file, black marshals forces for a potential pawn push. Asserting control over the file is the immediate objective here, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit weaknesses along that open pathway. Suddenly, the rook on a1 finds itself with a very unwelcome guest, directly challenging its dominance of the open file and forcing a difficult decision about its placement. Recapturing the rook immediately simplifies the position and aims to exploit the open, a file, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns. Reclaiming the piece after the capture initiates a complex positional battle. Black must now contend with white's potentially active rook on the open a file and the lingering pressure on the queenside pawns. Clearing the c-file opens a direct path for your rook, immediately creating tension on the newly liberated rank and challenging black's pawn structure. Prophylactically shoring up the kingside, a commendable attempt to prevent any immediate breakthroughs or pawn advances. Initiating a powerful kingside pressure by relocating the rook to its 6th rank, this move seeks to exploit the compromised pawn structure and the exposed black king, creating significant tactical opportunities and potentially isolating the enemy pieces. A desperate attempt to stir up activity before the inevitable rook endgame, sacrificing tempo for a fleeting check that black will neatly sidestep. Safeguarding the king from immediate threats on the open rank becomes paramount, shifting focus from offensive aspirations to defensive consolidation as the rook invasion is neutralized. Liberating the d-pawn creates immediate dynamism, aiming to destabilize white's central pawn structure and open lines for black's rooks. Repositioning the queen to chase down the aggressive pawn advance, forcing a reckoning with the exposed black king. The rook's sudden occupation of the 1st rank creates an intriguing positional puzzle. While it opens a direct assault on white's king, it also disconnects the black pieces, potentially leaving the queen isolated on an exposed square amidst a chaotic battlefield. A daring attempt to reclaim some queenside initiative by offering yet another pawn sacrifice, hoping to disrupt black's well-fortified central pawn chain and potentially open a line for the beleaguered rook. Suddenly, the queen re-engages the central fight, aiming to disrupt white's newly consolidated pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king if white isn't careful with piece placement. A bold repositioning, aiming to reclaim the initiative by striking at black's centralized rook, yet it risks leaving white's own monarch exposed to further infiltration through the open files. Seizing the opportunity, black aims to invigorate the isolated rook on the 2nd rank, preparing to challenge white's control of the now open c-file and potentially create counterplay against the weakened kingside. A decisive intervention forcing a change in the board's dynamic, this queen's sortie exploits the pinned knight to create immediate threats. Stepping the king onto the h7 square creates a crucial escape route, potentially shielding the monarch from the immediate threat of the queen and rook combination, and offering a vital pawn shield against further incursions down the open files. Unleashing the queen onto the open diagonal, white aims to exploit the exposed black king, creating immediate threats that demand a vigilant response. Gaining tempo on the queen, this maneuver seeks to disrupt white's already awkward pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the weakened queenside. The endgame is now upon us, and with the queen exchange, white embraces a simpler, albeit potentially long, path towards victory, simplifying the complexity of the kingside while leaving the doubled pawns on the c-file as a long-term target for black's rook and queen. Opening a path for the bishop to potentially contest the d-file, this pawn thrust signals a shift towards a more active, though possibly exposed, central presence. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside now is a bold gamble, potentially opening vital avenues for your monarch, but also creating weaknesses that a well-coordinated counterattack could exploit. King vulnerability becomes a paramount concern as the monarch ventures into the fray, potentially exposing itself to unforeseen threats down the newly opened g-file. Opening up a new avenue for your king's defense, this subtle pawn advance aims to provide crucial breathing room and secure a safe haven from the immediate threats lingering on the kingside. Pushing the pawn offers immediate activity, potentially forcing white to commit their king further by defending the weak f-pawn, but it also weakens the pawn chain and opens a diagonal for white's queen. Propping up that overloaded kingside pawns with a slightly awkward king maneuver, hoping to achieve some sort of defensive reinforcement, but it exposes the monarch more than it helps secure the structure. A bold attempt to disrupt white's pawn structure and open a line for the rook, though it risks leaving the king somewhat exposed, and creates a potentially isolated pawn on the d-file for black. Initiating a bold king march now is a gamble, aiming to leverage the open files and potentially exploit any defensive weakness that emerges, but it risks exposing your monarch prematurely in a position where pawn structure is still somewhat fluid. A bold pawn sacrifice to activate the rook and disrupt white's central pawn structure, aiming to exploit the open files that will emerge. The white king's centralizing sprint to safety from the king's side now faces an immediate counterthrust, its open path to a more active square unfortunately aligning it with a dangerous pawn storm brewing on the king side. The pawn push aims to free the rook and potentially attack the f2 pawn, but it sacrifices the passed d-pawn, which was the primary asset in this endgame. Repositioning the rook to the king side offers a unique defensive posture, indirectly pressuring the black pawns while keeping options open for a later regrouping action on the open c-file. Aggressively seeking counterplay, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's kingside pawns and potentially open lines for black's rook or queen, though it significantly weakens the pawn structure around the king. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice to open up lines and potentially exploit black's king's exposed position. The pawn sacrifice is accepted, ushering in a dramatic shift towards a king's gambit scenario where the black monarch now finds itself uncomfortably exposed on the king side, a consequence of its earlier flight and the open lines created. Solidifying control of the d-file with the rook is paramount now, aiming to disrupt the opponent's coordination and potentially create a passed pawn down the road. The rook, now a solitary guardian on the back rank, finds itself in a rather exposed position with the pawn storm threatening to overwhelm it.